Again, I wanted to reiterate that the restriction of commercial events in agriculture is something that county staff does not support. We would ask your commission to continue to allow events in agriculture with the findings that we've added. We think it's a way that agriculturalists can diversify and stay in agriculture, and we think it's important. Next is fees. There was a lot of question about the fees. The minor use permit fees is roughly $6,000. Conditional use permit fee, $8,000 to $10,000. Again, I think we have to come up with a totally new fee structure if those use permits are only good for 1 year.
I think it's really worth underscoring the fact that it's the property owner who would need to get the permit, and that would be the very same property owner who is benefiting from the fees that they are charging for the events. So, if you own a piece of property and it has facilities on it and you want to host events of this nature and charge money for them, then you need to come in and get a permit for that. But the individual nonprofits who are going to be renting your facility, or in some cases maybe even using it free of charge, they are not obligated to get a permit. Is that correct?
That's absolutely.
Okay.
Speaking of highlighting, so Mr. Rose, what I hear you saying there is that lots of nonprofits who are holding the events now are supposed to be getting a minor use permit, or the property owner is, and it's not happening.
I would presume they are getting it. I'm not going to presume anyone's breaking the law.
But it sounds like people are saying they don't have minor use permits, or think they do, or that currently they think they're not required to have anything right now, and that this is going to be an added burden somehow.
And what we're trying to do is make it less of a burden. We're trying to have some outs, make it a little bit easier.
Right, so I think that needs highlighting, because that's the intent of this for smaller scaled events and activities, to actually make it easier than the current code. But that's gotten completely sort of obscured here.
Correct.
And if I could just add on to that, it's not surprising that people would love the current status quo if in fact they are not in compliance and not being required to get permits for activities that in fact the ordinance requires them to get permits for. The problem with that is that if we continue with that status quo, those property owners and event sponsors and quite honestly even the county are hanging out there liable for legal challenges, because if one of those NIMBY neighbors that doesn't like the music or the parking or the traffic has an issue with this, clearly, if those events don't have minor use permits, they are not in compliance with the ordinance and they're in breach of the law. So we're trying to prevent those kinds of lawsuits and problems from happening.
There's been some conversation. I think this is a lot of, in part, the rub of two items that came up during public comment. The first of those is about the policy, Ag Policy 6. The policy talks to that sites in agriculture that are to have these visitor serving uses, that the visitor serving uses should be both secondary to and incidental to the agricultural use of the site. I know that there's not consensus on what that means. Traditionally, our office has interpreted that to mean that there needs to be quite clearly a primary agricultural use, and that the visitor use needs to be a minor proportion of the agricultural use. And I just wanted to pass out to you something that through this process has been developed. It was developed at the Ag Liaison Advisory Board and with their approval, and it's what our department's intent is when we apply this secondary and incidental approach. When the ordinance talks about a verification letter, we intend to look at two issues. One of the primary ag use, the top part of this page that goes by acreage amounts of different kinds of agricultural use. The bottom part of the page getting into what we're considering the incidental to this primary use, that the visitor use in aerial extent is a minor extent of the agricultural use. In most instances, 5% of the area would be dedicated to visitor use and no more. That's how we are trying to interpret the policy. And on page 2.9, that's how it plays out in the agricultural events. That doesn't show up in other portions of the ordinance currently, but would be, for all intents and purposes, for discretionary permits, the approach we would be using.
So, Mr. Eisensee, what I hear you saying is that the way your department has historically interpreted that language is by area, not by income or activity.
Correct.
So, for instance, you could have a situation where you have a very large ag parcel that runs a couple head of cattle, say, or, you know, similar, sheep, whatever, and maybe generates just a few $1,000s a year of income off that activity, if that. It may even run at a loss. But they could have a barn that they use as an event center that they operate 50 weekends out of the year that generates $500,000 of income, and you would consider that secondary and incidental to the ag use under this definition.
Theoretically, yes. I guess the second caveat that goes with this, or the caveat that goes with this, is we think that in all instances there is an appropriate size and scale that gets to the number of events and the size of the events that happen. And if you put those two things together, you should end up, hopefully, in the right place, where we're not determining whether or not the events are commercially and financially successful, or how successful they are, or whether or not the agricultural use is extremely financially successful or not. Those are areas that we're not especially interested in getting involved in.
Do you have a similar guidance document for determining the appropriate number, size, and scale of events on ag lands as well? If this deals particularly with, you know, the area, geographic standards, do you have similar guidance standards for your other criteria?
No, that's why we've been involved in the process of the ordinance process, of having those written into the ordinance language.
Okay.
We have not been in opposition to the idea that commercial or special events would occur on agriculture designated land, but again, jumping back to this clearly secondary and incidental, we think if they are allowed, they need to have this size and scale scoped appropriately. Our general sense is that the winery approach, the winery ordinance that sets a maximum of 6 events with up to 80 guests for a MUP, and more than that, either more events or more people with a conditional use permit, is an appropriate level to land, so that there's consistency between the winery ordinance and this ordinance. It sounds like there's a lot of angst out there that this is either going to be more restrictive or possibly more permissive, and the people that aren't governed by this new ordinance are either going to face new restrictions in the future or are going to, in fact, want more allowances in the future. So I think that that's something for your commission to consider. Finally, 2 final issues. One is we're not in support of reconvening the Ag Tourism Work Group. That work group convened for about 9 months in 2005 and 2006, met monthly, as well as had, I think, 6 subcommittees, a number of which met 5 or 6 or 7 times. So a lot of effort and energy did, in fact, go into the effort at that time. Each of those subcommittees developed some kind of position paper that represented, in some cases, broad consensus. In most cases, it represented little consensus and spoke to the range of issues that staff needed to address as this moved forward. I don't think that going back there, we're going to suddenly find that that group has consensus on these issues when they didn't in the past. There may be some reason to, as this commission or as the commission subcommittee works toward some conclusions on this, to invite the members of the subcommittee to a meeting with the commissioners so we can explain what we've done and to answer questions before coming back to the full planning commission. That might be a way. In fact, if we invited more elements of the ag industry at least to answer their questions